The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata, which of course means make it real in our life, in everything we do or say or think, to fully express awakened mind. Today is day 2 of the 7-day sesshin, the first in 2 in the row, January and February being just 4 days, 5 days in between, 6 days. Anyway, less than a week, which proves to be most efficient and powerful way to deepen one's practice. It's we worked with this version in October and November, as you've heard before, and it was dynamite, particularly since we continued to sit every morning and the days in between, other than the free day immediately following that first October sesshin, and did some alternative things, hike in the woods, a trip to Taos to investigate and order some Zendo clothing. And basically low-key things, but different things to refresh our minds and refresh our bodies. And then we plunged into the next sesshin, the November sesshin. And we'll do something similar this time as well, and again in March and April, because it's such a powerful way to practice. It offers a tremendous opportunity to not just come up and then try to keep your practice going for months before the next sesshin, but you can just dive right in within a few days after the end of the last one. And the result is that it's not that hard. The result is that it's quite easy, actually, to go much deeper because you're already primed. You're already at a high point, and you can just take it with a little dip in between and go higher, or I guess we would really say deeper yet. So that is something that we are planning at Mountain Gate through well, this January, February pair and the March, April pair. And I'm sure we will continue it in the fall. And the summer is a little bit uncertain because we will be doing, we hope, the Regaining Balance retreats for women veterans with PTSD, which are not sesshin. Those are very, very finely curated special retreats that allow women veterans to work on healing. We teach them tools that can help that process unfold more readily. But they're only 4-day retreats, well, 5 days, counting that you come the night before or the evening before. But in between those, we will have at least Zazenkais and possibly some other sesshin as well. So I want to first share with you some Tibetan teachings. These are from, most of them are from Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, who was a very recognized, deeply realized human being, and the father, I believe, of Mingyur Rinpoche, who, as you know, is the author of actually a number of books. The most recent one was A Monk's Journey Through the Living, that's the Bardo of Living and Dying, I think is what it's titled. And I highly recommend it. It is very inspiring and very enlightening in a certain way. So Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, in this book called Quintessential Dzogchen, Confusion Dawns as Wisdom. Confusion dawns as wisdom. That's what is unfolding. in our practice, particularly during sesshin when we do concentrated practice. Confusion is dawning as wisdom. Little by little, subtly. Sometimes it's not even recognized until you find yourself in a situation where you realize you're responding differently than you would have before. And it's a more enlightened response. It's a more open and free response. It's a more let go response. Our basic natures is essentially identical with the ground. Has two basic aspects, primordial purity and spontaneous presence. Primordial, which means it is ongoing and original. There is no precursor to it. Purity, this is who we are. And spontaneous presence, our mind's empty essence related to primordial purity, while its cognizant nature is linked to spontaneous presence. And this is what we're working to uncover. We call it Buddha nature. We call it our original mind. It is called in other religions, God, Allah, mind essence. There are many, many terms for what cannot really be named or really cannot really be described accurately because any description is not what it is. And here's another quote. The freedom or free will is possible because in the midst of samsara, despite its conditioned nature, we always have a degree of direct awareness and authentic experience. This gives us hope that even as confused as we may be in our mind, even as covered up that original nature may seem, there is still access to it. And even though we are in the midst of confusion, at the same time, there is the possibility of authentic connection. So it's not like you're going from 0 to 100 in however many lifetimes. What is happening is this potential is offering that even in the midst of the confused, maybe angry, maybe frustrated, maybe deeply sad, maybe fearful mind, there is still an element of authentic presence. And it's tuning in to whatever is going on in our body in the midst of whatever it is that's challenging, that allows us to reconnect with that authentic essence. Our mind and its experiences participate simultaneously in the conditionings of ignorance and in the freedom of direct awareness. From ignorance comes a dualistic way of experiencing things in terms of subject and object, and this creates the individual ego-centered consciousness, which manifests the different passions. From direct awareness, on the other hand, positive, non-ego-centered qualities arise. It is from these afflictions or from these positive qualities that negative or positive karma respectfully arises. And then one more. This is from another Tibetan master, the third Karmapa. All phenomena are projections of the mind. Mind is not a mind. The mind is empty in essence. Although empty, everything constantly arises in it. Through the deeper examination of the mind, may we find its innermost root. May we find its innermost root. And you've heard many times that behind me is the scroll over the altar, at the top of which is an enso which represents our true mind. Perfect, nothing lacking, nothing can be added, nothing, it is perfect just as it is. And then beneath it are the kanji. They are brushed by Mitra-roshi for this zendo. Out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. And this is a different way of saying what I've just been reading to you. Out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. Out of the ground of being, out of that primordial purity comes everything. Our ideas, our thoughts. And if we are conditioned through experiences, which everybody is, we have ideas about ourselves, usually negative, not always. Sometimes people have pretty high images of themselves, which are not necessarily accurate either. But this whole self-image thing is a mirage. It is not who we really are. It's who we think we are. It's who we assume we are. And even no two people will feel the same way about us. Other people will perceive us very differently. And that's based on their conditioning and their perception or misperception. So how do we uncover this primordial purity? Because that's what we're trying to do in Zazen, is uncover it. It's there. There's no question about that. It cannot be anywhere else. So how do we uncover it? Well, in the Rinzai Zen system, we have this amazing practice called Sogen in Japanese, which we term the extended out breath. The benefit of this is in cutting away attachments. And cutting away sounds actually rather inaccurate, but it comes out of a samurai history in Japan. Letting go attachments is probably a better way to put it. Attachments to what? What we think we need, who we think we are, all of that. So as we extend the out breath, we are focusing on both the experience of the breathing out in our body, and we take it out as far as we can take it, letting go everything else. We're not trying to, for example, keep a koan in mind. We're not trying to talk to ourselves about what we hope to get. What we are doing is simply opening to the yearning, the need to return to something most precious that we have lost contact with, we think. It's never lost contact with us. In fact, we are it, but it can feel like we've lost contact. And as we breathe out with that yearning, using that yearning, the sense of yearning, to reach farther, letting go of all outward concerns. As Bodhidharma said, let go of outward concerns, let go of inward concerns as well. In other words, you're only focusing on the experience, the bodily experience of breathing out. You don't have to pay attention to what's happening around you. And this is a challenge for anyone who's experienced trauma, because anyone who has experienced trauma doesn't feel safe anywhere, because there's always the potential danger that they might be hurt again, unfortunately. Yet there are some places, like the Zendo here, is a safe haven. And so as you sit on the Zendo seat, to dare to trust that if you let go your concerns with what's going on around you, if you allow yourself to dive deeply within yourself, it will be okay. Not only will it be okay, but you will end up freer than you could imagine, even with one breath. And of course, we do it again and again and again, because our concern about not letting go makes a lot of things difficult in terms of letting go that breath, or bringing out that breath. We have thoughts, we have itches, we have sneezes, we have anxiety, we have all kinds of things that comes up in an attempt to keep us off that path. And we can see this in the story of the Buddha's first sesshin, where he came to his great awakening, where he was sitting deeply absorbed because he knew finally that that was the only way to go, is within. And the Buddhist devil, Mara, who is considered to be really an apparition of our own mind, came forth and brought his beautiful daughters before the Buddha to dance beguilingly, to try to entice him away from his practice. And that didn't work. He was so determined to continue practicing. And this is how we must face Makyo that comes up for us, is to be determined not to shove them away, but to sort of go down through them to what is deeper, and they will fade. We acknowledge that they're there, but we don't chase them, because we've got a deeper, more important goal. Then when the dancing daughters didn't work, he metaphorically pulled out his hordes of demons, who threw lances and poured boiling mud on the Buddha. And that, of course, is a metaphor for pain. And most of us who sat Zazen for a long time have experienced painful knees, painful backs, whatever. And that didn't work either. So finally, he pulled out his biggest gun, and that was, you can't do it. Who do you think you are? Somebody special? You can't do it. You couldn't possibly do it. And that is a big one for all of us, because most of us have grown up with some inclination, particularly if we've been traumatized, that we can't do it. We can't save ourselves. We don't have the power. We're helpless. And that can come up big time in Zazen. And again, the way to deal with it is to walk right into the anxiety, the assumption, which is not an intellectual assumption, but the sensation of helplessness, and just keep plugging along. There are amazing stories. There was a Mexican man a few years back who did not pay his, whatever you call it, to the cartel. And so they grabbed him and chopped his legs off. So he somehow managed to get to the United States, and he was trying to get a visa that would allow him to remain in the United States as someone who was endangered in the country he came from. And he actually rode a bicycle all around Texas to advertise his plight. This is a man with his legs chopped off beneath his knees, and he rode a bicycle. There is the story in India, also a similar one, where a young girl rode a bicycle carrying her father something like 700 miles to get him back to his village. because there was some urgent need to do that. And my friend who in high school was riding in a car with another high school buddy, and the car flipped and his friend was caught under the car, and he lifted up the car and his friend was able to be pulled out. So we have powers way beyond what we assume. The idea of learned helplessness is real, and it comes as a result of situations where we learned in those particular situations, usually traumatic situations, that we didn't have the power to make a difference. We didn't have the power to flee. We were too small or not strong enough, or the person had a gun or a knife or whatever. And it taught us that it just from one or maybe two or more experiences like that, it gave us a broad assumption, and we generalized that we couldn't do anything that really mattered. Don't believe it. Walk into the feeling, own it, and keep working. Remember that. And there's another story that I saw interviewed on television when I was waiting for the truck to get worked on long years ago. There was a guy who was working on his car and it fell off the jack and he was under it. And there was no one home except his 8-year-old daughter. So he managed to get her to lower the jack and get it into the right position. And then she was not strong enough to actually raise it by pushing on it. So she sat on it and managed to raise the jack high enough that he could get out. An 8-year-old. There are so many stories like that. So we all have ideas about how little we can do. And that usually comes out in Zazen. Because one part of us really wants to be free. One part of us really wants to return to what we have sensed is real and important and vital and precious. And yet another part of us is deeply invested in the status quo, particularly the self-image. So it's working upstream for a long time. And there's many ways to go about this work. Some people will go and spend their life in a monastery. That's not happening much anymore. It was the traditional Asian way to do things, but it's not really that way in America. Very, very few people go into monasteries for life. Very few people get ordained as monastics in Buddhism, although in the Tibetan tradition, there's a fair number. But in Zen, not so much. And there's a big lay practice, which is fine. You do not need to wear Buddhist robes in order to practice Zen. You do not need to wear Buddhist robes in order to go very deep in your practice of Zen. It boils down to every person's individual karma. As I said, some people will go into a monastery or a Zen center and stay there for the rest of their lives. There was basically only one person at Rochester Zen Center that did that, and that was Bowden. There was one monk who was ordained that remained a monk and remained in training. Actually went to Bukokuji and was there for a very long time. Still goes back to help out there, even though Sogen-ji is passed away. But most people came, and in fact, it was really interesting because when I went there, I was older than everybody else. I was 33, 34, and everybody else was in their early, very early 20s, and very enthusiastic about living in a monastic setting, basically. And then something happened about 10 years later. They began to feel the biological clocks ticking. They coupled up and they actually got married and started having kids. And then they needed to get jobs. And it wasn't working for them to live at the Zen Center anymore. And so they spread out and continued their practice. Some of them went in different directions. Frank Howard and his wife Gretchen were at the Rochester Zen Center when I was there for several years. We were all there together. And eventually Frank and Gretchen turned to the Tibetan tradition, and they continue to practice in that tradition. It varies according to our karmic inclinations. In my own case, I was at the Rochester Zen Center from 1976 through much of 1981, the early part of 81, no, the mid part of 81. I moved to Santa Fe because we were, there were 17 of us moved to Santa Fe to help create what was then Roshi Kapleau's dream of a country retreat place, a country zendo. And we had actually started building it. Well, not building it, but we had actually started renovating it. We had a purchase offer on a piece of property, but then various things happened I don't need to go into, but the karma simply wasn't there for it. We tried 2 more times, and then coincidentally, Roshi Kapleau had to return to Rochester because Tony Packer, who had originally taken over the Rochester Zen Center, realized that she was more inclined to a different kind of teaching and didn't feel she was a Zen Buddhist, and therefore she could not legally be the head of the Rochester Zen Center because you have to be a Buddhist to be able to do that. So she left and formed her own center, and almost half the Rochester Zen Center went with her. So most of us who came out to Santa Fe stayed in Santa Fe, but we had bought a van, and we used to van pool all the way back to Rochester for sesshin. Every single sesshin we went back to Rochester. And otherwise we had a local sangha that where we sat and all, but then most of us had to go in and get jobs. And Gordy and Jim, for example, went and built their own homes. And I started working freelance again, doing graphic design, freelance, so that I could uproot and take off to Rochester for sesshin and come back and continue my work. And I would go back then sometimes for 3 months at a time, and then be 3 months more in Santa Fe. And then I went for 6 months. And then I got a job at Barkman Engineering, which led me to not have that kind of free time. And at one point, the fellow engineers at Barkman were encouraging me to go get an engineering degree. And so I went down to University of New Mexico. I'd always dreamed of completing architecture. You can get a bachelor's in architecture, but that does not allow you to sign drawings. In other words, you cannot do anything but housing or renovations. And if you get your master's degree, you can. So they have a program in master's in architecture at UNM. So I went and talked to them, and it wasn't going to work out. They were requiring me to do classes in work that I'd already done professionally for 15 years. It didn't seem very open-minded of them. So then I went to the engineering school, and they said, "We'd love to have you. Come on in." So in the hour drive back to Santa Fe, where I was living at the time, I thought, gosh, it'd be really terrific to get an engineering degree. I found the work at Barkman really interesting and fun. And then I thought, okay, that's an undergraduate degree. I would not be able to get any real funding for it. I'd have to get school loans, and then I'd have to work to pay off the school loans after I got the degree, and I might get 2 weeks off a year. That's 2 sesshin. That's not very many. And I decided then to ask Roshi Kapleau to ordain me, because that was my direction, to spend my life doing Zen practice, ultimately teaching. And I also spent 4 to 5 months at a time in Mexico with Roshi Kapleau as one of his attendants. In fact, I was the one that picked him up and carried him to the car when he fell down the stairs and broke his arm. And it was challenging and rewarding to work with him directly in that capacity. He's a workaholic. He was a workaholic. And so you were on duty 24/7. But it was fine. It worked. And then after that, he moved to Santa Fe. A house was bought for him, and I was one of his 2 attendants in Santa Fe for that first year. And then it didn't work out in Santa Fe, and he moved to Florida, where it was warmer and where there was a welcoming Sangha. And I moved back to Rochester and spent the last year and a half in Rochester, then met Mitra-roshi, who came to Rochester for a visit, and someone gifted me a sesshin at what was then Cloud Mountain, the basic beginning of Tohama Monastery, which was yet to be unfolded many years later. And then I realized that I needed to go again and continue training with Mitra-roshi. So I went to live in Japan for 3 years. And then Roshi Kapleau called me back, and I returned and set up Mountain Gate. But I also continued to return to Sogen-ji for 5 or 6 weeks every year until the last 5 years or so, when it just became too expensive for me. I was not able to do that. And my work here and at Hidden Valley Zen Center had reached a point where it was difficult to take the time off as well. So that's one way to practice. Chunks of time and concentrated practice. Allah, our double sesshin here. And other time, and then some time practicing on your own or coming to daily sittings, and then another dive, or going into residence at some place like Mountain Gate for a period of time, several months, half a year, 2 years, whatever. These are the potential formats that could be very effective for Westerners, because we're not traditional Asians. The culture in Asia, even as well as the United States, is very different from how it used to be. And many, many more people who have no karma to get ordained or to live in a monastery for the rest of their lives are still wanting deeply to practice. And that's okay. And there are different ways to do it. One of the other things I saw in Rochester was that people would come and they probably wouldn't be on staff, which meant resident at Rochester Zen Center, but they would be coming to every sesshin. They would come to all the sittings if they were local, and they would come to at least the Sunday morning sittings every weekend. If they were out of town. And so it was a very concentrated practice too, while also holding jobs and having families. And then after 2 to 3, 5 years, they would disappear. Okay, and whatever need they had to practice was gone. But then what we were seeing is 10 years later, 15 years later, these same people were back. Only this time they had a very deep commitment to practice, and they stayed long term. So that, again, that's another way that it has been done. I offer this because this is not something that most people are aware of. There's a sort of this general idea that we have to go and spend our life in the monastery, or at least spend our every single waking moment at the Zen Center or Mountain Gate. And that's not necessarily the case. It depends on the depth of yearning you have, and the willingness to commit your life to that. But it can also help to take a break sometimes. At Sogen-ji, we saw people burn out. It's very, very intensive practice there. Basically you have 3 days off in a month, and they're not really all day off. They're off from breakfast, the end of breakfast cleanup, until the beginning of supper. And in the winter, that's not very long, because the supper bell goes in terms of when it begins to get dark. In the summer, of course, there's longer time. But during those times, you basically have to do your wash. You have to take care of your personal situation, because there literally is no time. When I was first training there, and the schedule is always changing. Roshi makes it more concentrated, then slightly less concentrated, and then more concentrated again. And so there were times when I had to choose between a 5-minute quick nap or brushing my teeth. Because unlike here, where we don't go back to the Zendo after the meal, they do at Sogen-ji. So at the end of the meal, it's not the end of the sitting. You go back and you sit again for a little bit, not long, but a little bit. So your window of opportunity to get any kind of rest is extremely short. As well, you're in the Hondo by 4 o'clock every morning, except the 3 free days, and you don't end the evening until something like 10, 11 o'clock, 11 at least if you're in sesshin. It doesn't leave you very much time for sleep. So there also is not the opportunity to work on any psychological issues that come up. And that's essential as well in practice, particularly for us Westerners. Things will come up. Zazen takes takes the lid off on our issues. And if we've got some deep stuff going on, it's important to work with it. Otherwise, it's going to interfere with our Zazen. We can shove it out of the way by driving that mu down and trying to avoid anything else, which is not the way to practice, but is a misinterpretation of the traditional way of practice. And you do that, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. And that was what was happening to people at Sogen-ji. They were leaving after 7 years, 5 years, because it just was so extreme. It was impossible to keep it up when they were trying to keep the lid on the stuff that they were not allowed to process. There really wasn't any time to process it, even if you had the opportunity. Which is why taking a little bit of a break sometimes can make a difference and refresh you, help you come back to the Zendo in a very different frame of mind, ready to really dive in. So at this point, I've gone over time. I appreciate your patience. Thank you very much for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. Where is